Welcome to Author Stories, the podcast where we talk to the best writers in the industry and discuss writing and the creative process. Whether you're a writer, a reader, or both, we hope you'll find something here that makes you love books and the writers that create them. You can find archives of all of the great conversations I've had with authors over the years at hankgarner.com. Take some time and browse around there. I'm sure you'll find a new author to love, find inspiration for your own creative life, and find a new story to get lost in. Let's thank some sponsors who make the show possible. We're so happy to have our friend Crystal Pico Watanabe as a sponsor of the show. Crystal is one of the best editors in the business, and she has just debuted a new service that I think you'll absolutely love and will help you to up your writing game. Pico's School of Wordcraft and Editing has just debuted, and the first course is called Properly Punctuating Dialogue. It's a mini course and can be completed in just about 20 minutes. It covers the basics of dialogue punctuation. Authors can get access to the new school and the course for free by signing up for Crystal's author newsletter, Notes from Pico. Go to picoshouse.com/newsletters. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com/newsletters. More in-depth courses will be added in 2020. Make sure you don't miss a thing. picoshouse.com/newsletters. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2 are only 99 cents for a limited time. The gods are rightfully imprisoned, and Cess intends to keep them that way. But her terrorist father has other plans. Gregory D. Little's Unwilling Souls is a pulse-pounding chase through an epic fantasy world of adventure, sinister conspiracy, and a magical industrial revolution fueled by harvested human souls. Cess is the daughter of powerful parents who would very much like to kill one another and who therefore pretend she doesn't exist. An apprentice jailer of the gods, Cess spends her days learning to forge the tools needed to maintain the gods' prison. When her terrorist father attacks the prison on her 16th birthday, Cess is forced to flee after the secret of her parentage is revealed. Suddenly on the wrong side of the law, Cess realizes the very father who abandoned her may be the only one who can protect her. But some secrets are darker than parentage. On her way to find her father, Cess will uncover truths about her family and herself that will shatter her understanding of the world and risk the return of the gods themselves. Unwilling Souls and its sequel, Ungrateful God, are on sale now for only 99 cents. The third book of the series is coming early next year, so now is the perfect time to get up to speed. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2, only 99 cents for a limited time. Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories, Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Charles Soule on the show with me. He has a phenomenal new book. It's called Anyone, and if you are familiar with any of Charles's amazing work, then you will instinctively know that this is a book that you've got to have on your shelf, and I can vouch for that. Welcome to the show, Charles.
Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it. Thanks for the kind words about the book, too.
You're most welcome. Well deserved. Charles, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
The first real memory that I have in fourth grade, I was in a just a fourth grade classroom, nothing major, and my teacher was one of those great teachers who really tried to find the thing that would engage each of her students individually. So student A might need a lot of time, running around, and student B might need a lot of time with the paintbrush in the art class, whatever. And then I was the one that she thought could benefit from maybe trying to tell stories. And so she was like, because we had these free periods in class, and so she kind of pushed me toward, why don't you see what, tell your own story, write something down, see what you think. And so I ended up writing a little story about a unicorn. And two of my friends, Brad and Greg Moore, ended up illustrating it. And so we made kind of a fourth grader's version of a kid's picture book. And so that's, I guess, where I kind of caught the bug. But then from then on, it was something I always did. I was always writing stories. Took a lot of creative writing classes when I could, college, high school, all over the place. So, yeah, I've been writing for a long time.
Were you a bookish kid? Did you read a lot?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I remember very clearly getting these big, I think they were called like treasury editions or golden classics or something like that. And they were hardcover books. I remember them being about dictionary size. They probably were less smaller than that in real life because, obviously I was a kid, so my perspective was off. But they had kind of gilt-edged pages, and they were classics, right? So these would be things like Black Beauty and Robinson Crusoe and Swiss Family Robinson and Little Men and Little Women and just all of these children's books that were considered classics by some editor who was in charge of the line at the time. So I had just a pile of those, and I feel like my mom maybe had a subscription or something like that to them because they would keep showing up every so often. So I read those over and over again, and then I kind of found my way to the Chronicles of Narnia. Things like Tom Swift, like there was a Tom Swift revival series that came out when I was a kid where they had newer authors writing those stories.
Yes.
I remember those very clearly. And then from then on, it was like I found things like, actually, it was the first series, the first set of books. I was like, oh wow, this is really, really good, and I wanted as many of them as I could. It was a series of books called the Bobbsey Twins, which were, I mean, this is ancient stuff, really, but like they were in kind of the same family and maybe even written by the same person. It was all very mysterious about who wrote those books as like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. Like those were kind of the three. It was Bobbsey Twins, Nancy Drew, and Hardy Boys. They're all kind of the same, I don't know, same publisher, same. I should probably look it up because it's probably not as mysterious as I think it is. But I feel like there was one author, either there was one author who just wrote them all under different pen names, or there was a factory where there are 100 different authors and they were all churning them out, all at the same time. So, but I thought those were great, like kid solving mysteries. I loved it, and so I read a lot of those. And then from then, I mean, those were the gateway drugs that led me to all kinds of stuff. Like I was a big science fiction reader when I was a kid. Things like Piers Anthony's Ant Theories, just tons of stuff. So
I have a feeling that our childhood bookshelves were very similar. I also had those gilded edged books, those classics, and I think my mom found a subscription to those because we would have some show up about once a quarter in the mailbox or something like that.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah. So crazy. And those Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and the Bobbsey Twins, I think that those were, if I remember the story I've heard right, that they had quite a few ghost writers who would write as the author of those, and a little bit like comics are today, where you have a new creative team that will come in and take a storyline somewhere, and it's still the same Superman, Batman, Daredevil, whatever. But new creators come in. Speaking of that, when did you fall in love with comics? Because you have written some of the most iconic storylines in modern comics. Where did your love of comics come from?
It came from my dad. So I guess if my mom was pushing me toward things like Black Beauty and Swiss Family Robinson, my dad was definitely a comics guy. He had things like and he grew up reading comics, and so when we would go to his parents' house, my grandparents' house, he like in his childhood bedroom there would be just kind of like a stack of comics in the closet. So I'd read titles like like Thunder Agents, which is it's kind of an obscure set of characters. I think they're owned by DC now, and they did a revival a few years back. But basically, they were kind of proto superheroes. They were like 1950s, 1960s superheroes. And then at one point, I remember very distinctly, it was me and my siblings, my older brother, my younger sister, and my younger brother we were about to go on some kind of long drive, and my dad vanished into a drugstore. He parked the car, vanished into a drugstore, came out, and handed each of us a comic. And mine was an issue of the Fantastic Four, and it was gosh, I looked it up. It was like Fantastic Four 178 or something like that. I believe it was a John Byrne issue where the Fantastic Four meets the Norse god, the Asgardian. And it was like early on in the comics world a little bit, so like that hadn't happened very much. I guess it was kind of a landmark issue. I didn't know. All I knew was that the story didn't finish, right? You read a comic, and then it kind of drops you in the middle of whatever the story is, and then at the end there's some incredible cliffhanger that you have to find the next issue to know what's going to happen. And in my situation, right, like this was just an issue my dad picked up at the drugstore, and I had no way to, I didn't even know where you could get another one. So I never finished that story, so I have no idea how it ended. But a little bit later, just a few years past that, we would often spend like Christmas down in Florida with family. I grew up in Michigan, but we would be down in Florida, and there was a grocery store there that had this great invention called the spinner rack. And a spinner rack, which they don't have anymore, unfortunately, in the grocery stores, but when I was young, they would be just a wire rack like you'd see with magazines, but instead of magazines, it had comics, single issues of comics on it, and it had this great sign on top that just said, "Hey kids, comics." And so you would go through and kind of find what you would find. But one of the things that was great about it was that they added new issues to it. They didn't always take old issues away. So if you kind of dug through it, you could find, if issue 4 was the one that just came out, you could maybe poke around, and if you're lucky, you could find 3, 2, 1, whatever. So I started reading a series called Secret Wars 2, which has not stood up well. That book has not stood the test of time. It's considered kind of I don't know if travesty is too strong a word, but it's not held up as one of the greatest comic storylines of all time. But to me, it was like it had all of the heroes in one place. It had Spider-Man and the X-Men and Doctor Doom and all these crazy people having these adventures. And I just went on a huge hunt that vacation for every issue I could find. And that got me into kind of the bug of finding different titles and collecting stuff and follow these characters to different places, because Secret Wars had everybody in it. So if I liked the Human Torch, I could just go track down wherever the Human Torch was going to show up next, because the books were pretty good about telling you where to go find everything. So that's where it started, and it's never really stopped. And now I get to write them, which is an amazing thing.
So with this pedigree of literary influences, from the classic shelf to the spinner rack, you take that love of story and naturally become an attorney.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. So, yeah, I mean, I was writing all the time, and I also did a lot of work in music. When I graduated from college, I had a degree in Chinese, and majored in Chinese and minored in music composition. And so I thought that I was either going to go work overseas somewhere, or I was going to be a musician. And I put a lot of time and effort to, like, I play guitar, I'm pretty accomplished, like I've had a ton of bands, I made a bunch of money doing that. And then my mom just was like, well, take the LSAT, which is the sort of the admissions exam for law school. Like, take the LSAT, just see what happens. And then I ended up doing really well on it. And then she was like, well, just apply to some schools, just see what happens. And I got into a school called Columbia University, which is a really, really extraordinary law school. And so she's like, if you get into Columbia, you have to go to Columbia. And so I did. And I don't want to say that, like, I don't want to imply that these weren't my own choices. Obviously, I was a grown person then, and I could make my own choices. But I knew, like, I liked the prestige and I liked the analysis, and I liked a lot of those things about Columbia. But I knew fairly early that the law wasn't really the path that was going to be the most fulfilling to me. So as you go through law school, particularly a school like Columbia, and you take out the student loans to pay for it, and you realize, oh my God, this is really quite a commitment. I started sort of looking for a path that had more creativity in my life, and I knew it was very clear that I would not be able to continue doing music on the same level that I had intended to. You just can't skip out from the law firm or from court because you have a gig. But I thought writing was something that I would be able to do along the same, at the same time, or around the edges is probably a better way to put it. So I took the bar. I graduated from law school, took the bar exam, and which was a pretty grueling summer, but got it done. And then, because it's a grueling summer, attorneys, or students really, I guess they're not attorneys yet, they haven't been admitted, but people who have just taken the exam often take what's called a bar vacation. And so they will go someplace just for a week or two to not think about law at all, because it's all you've thought about really for the last 3 years, and in particular the last 3 months before you take the bar. It's just constant, like 12 hours a day of cramming. And so it was very intense, and people just go sit on a beach and don't do anything. So that's what I did. I went on a trip basically to as far away from New York as I could get, and while I was on that trip, I was like, okay, I've taken the bar. I'm going to be a lawyer, assuming I passed, which I did, thankfully. But I'm going to be an attorney. I need to get this other outlet going in a real way. So I went into like just a stationery store. I was in Sydney, Australia, and I went and bought just a longhand notebook, a composition book, one of those black and white kind of modeled cover. Nothing weird about it. We've all seen 1,000 of them. So I just bought one, and I started writing my first novel that day in longhand. So it was probably, if it wasn't the next day after I took that test, it was pretty close. I started writing my first novel. And so I wrote the first book called The Land of 10,000 Things, 3 of those composition books in longhand, then typed it all in and started editing and got an agent. And that the path did not, I was thinking, well, this will be quick. I'll just write a novel. I'll be done with it in a year or 2. And then that'll be the end of my legal career. I'll get some massive deal and I'll be off to the races. It did not happen that way. So, but that's okay.
That's fantastic. But it didn't happen that way, but yet you persevered. Did you publish that first novel?
No. So I guess this is part 2 of the path, right? So, so what happened was I finished the novel. I got an agent, a guy named John Michael, who was with Morhaime Literary Agency, who was great. He took a chance on basically a query letter, sort of based on an introduction from a friend, and he took a chance on somebody who not only was, unpublished, but was sort of untried. Like this is, I kind of jumped into the deep end and wrote a novel without really having any real significant writing experience. And so he gave me notes, and I made edits and changes and so on, and finally we got it to a point, and this is about 3 or 4 years after starting to write it, that we took it out to publishers. And the novel is about, it's set in around 480 China, so kind of ancient China in the Warring States period. And it was a magical realist thing, like sort of like a Chinese fantasy novel about the sort of stealth about the advent of Taoism and what that meant to existing structures of religion in China at the time, and just a lot of stuff I found really fascinating, because as I mentioned earlier, I majored in Chinese in college, and I speak Mandarin decently well, and I just thought it would be something that I could really dig into, which I did. But publishers did not find it to be as commercial as I did, and so they all passed. So it was basically a 6-week period of my agent taking it out, and I was sort of, it was over a summer. I remember very clearly, like I had my birthday in the middle of that time, and I was like, this is going to work. This is going to work. And then it didn't work. And so it was it was very hard to sort of reconcile. And I talked to him, my agent, when he said, this is what happened. And I said, okay, so what are we doing next? Like, where are we taking it next? Where are we going to sell it next? And he's like, I took it everywhere. Like, it's done. And I sort of, but that was, that's 3.5, 4 years of work. While I was doing a lot of other work as an attorney, it was really challenging to get it to the point. And I was like, I climbed this mountain. I'm so close to the top. And now it just stops. It was very, very, it was heartbreaking, honestly.
Yeah.
But at the time, like just before he had taken it out to submit it, sorry, there's an ambulance going by.
It's okay.
All right, should be a little better. So just before John took it out, I had finished it, obviously, but for a couple little small passes. And so he had said, why don't you get started on your next novel, so that if this goes well, you'll be able to have something else that's ready to go fairly soon after. And I said, that's a great idea. So I got to work. So this is just a little bit before Land of 10,000 Things went out, and I got to work on a novel that was called, at the time, just Tomorrow. And then for a little while it was called Tomorrow is Today. And that I finished a draft of, and I was very happy with it. I was very proud of it. And I took it to him. And so I finished sort of the draft after all this had happened with Oracle Year not going. So I finished the draft, and I took it to John, and I said, I think this could be good. Do you want to take a look at it? And he said, I would love to, except I'm retiring from being an agent. I'm done with that. Yeah, I'm done with that business. And, you know, I'm sure it's great, but, like, you're going to have to find a new one. I'm like, okay, so who are you going to send me to? Who's going to be my new agent? He's like, it doesn't work that way. You have to go through the whole process again of finding someone. And I was like, God damn, I'm sorry. I was like, gosh darn it.
It's okay.
Yeah, this is just so, it was like, again, heartbreaking, because you write a book, and then it takes so long, and it's so intense, and it's so focused and difficult that the idea of doing all that work, I guess, kind of for nothing is what it felt like at the time, was just too much. And so I said, forget novels. Like, I'm not interested in novels anymore. I'm going to do something that doesn't have quite as many gatekeepers, that I don't need an agent for the same way, that I can maybe control the process a little bit more thoroughly myself. And so that is what led me into trying to figure out how to be a comics writer, really.
And you have spent, you still are, quite a large amount of time writing comics, and some of the most iconic runs. Your run on Daredevil was absolutely epic. You have written this great series, a couple of series for Star Wars, with Darth Vader, where you really got to fill in a lot of the blanks that we have for Darth Vader. And then you wrote this other, epic run where you killed Wolverine. When writing other characters, and let's just take Darth Vader and Wolverine for instance, where with writing Vader, you're taking a character that we all know. We don't really know an awful lot about him. We all have filled in blanks with our imaginations. So you're taking something that everyone has an imaginary life for, and you're adding some color and character to that. And then with something like the death of Wolverine, you're taking this well-loved, iconic character and bringing him to, this emotional end for people. When dealing with existing characters like that and going places that people may be uncomfortable going. How do you handle that, and how is it different writing in an existing universe with existing characters versus your novel work where you're creating whole new worlds and kind of have a blank slate? How do you juggle those two aspects of your creative life?
Sure. I've actually been fortunate to be able to do some really strong original work in comics too.
Yes, like curse words.
Yeah, curse words and Letter 44, and the new book I'm working on now, Undiscovered Country, with my friend Scott Snyder. But I think the main difference is this, right? When you're working with a known character that is owned by somebody else, and these days most of the time that's going to be either Disney or Warner Brothers. If you're talking about DC or Marvel or Star Wars, they
right.
have those licenses. These are characters that generate, no exaggeration, billions of dollars, some of them, for their parent organization over their lifetimes. They're 9-figure, 10-figure creations. And so there are rules, and there are things that you cannot do with them. I mean, you are supposed to tell a great story, but you have to tell a story with that character, and you cannot really alter them in a way that will make them sort of less valuable. And so it's in kind of an IP proposition that's tricky. In comics, it's kind of interesting because comics are not low stakes, and particularly because stories in comics generally are the source material for a lot of the films and things that we do see. Like all those Marvel movies pretty much came from runs in the comics. But the thing about comics is that if somebody does something really egregious to a character that makes them unappealing in some way, so I did a long run on Daredevil, as you said. So let's say Daredevil for a while decides he's just gonna run around naked. That's gonna be his costume because he doesn't care. He's blind. What's the big deal? He's just gonna run around naked. And so he's just flopping all around New York City, and that's it. And so you could see that might sort of be an unusual choice that might in some ways diminish the value of that character in the pop culture space, right? But not forever, because the next creative team comes along and they have Daredevil put his red suit back on, and everything is kind of back to normal, and everyone just doesn't talk about the time Daredevil was swinging around New York with no clothes on anymore. And so it's it's like that in comics. Like whatever any character does, there's nothing a writer or an artist can do to a character that the next team down the line can't undo. It's part of what I call the churn in comics. So that's sort of something you kind of take into account when you're writing a licensed character, is that you have to sort of stay within the boundaries of the character. Or you should sort of, I think. But even if you don't, it can, it could be fixed, so to speak. If you're working on something that's in a kind of a different sphere, like a movie or a TV thing with one of those characters, I think it's very different. Like if there was a movie with Daredevil doing what I just described, I think it would be, that character that would not be able to be unseen. People would always be thinking about that every time they thought about the character, which is just sort of a difference between movies and comics. And I think there are good things and bad things about both approaches. So when you're working with one of these licensed characters, you have to play by the rules. But you also, it's not all bad, right? Because the bonus is that you get the bump from the fact that there are 40, sometimes 80 years of history with this character. And people forget about the bad stories and they just remember the awesome ones. So if you're talking about Batman, there have been some really garbage Batman stories over the years and really bizarre Batman stories and things that have taken the character to outlandish places. People don't remember that. They remember, Michael Keaton being awesome. They remember, the Dark Knight Returns comics by Frank Miller. They remember my buddy Scott's run.
Scott Snyder, yeah.
Of course, yeah. Like they remember the really good stuff. And when you come on to be the next Batman writer, you have all of that goodwill, kind of like the wind at your back, right? Like you're sailing on the ship of Batman with the wind of fandom at your back, and that goes really well until you do something egregious, and then fandom that wind turns into a hurricane really quickly, and it gets really crazy. But there's a shorthand to it, right? If I drop the Joker into a Batman story, everybody knows exactly what that means. Whereas if I'm creating a hero and a villain in an original story, I have to do all the legwork to make that hero and that villain interesting. So, and make readers invested in all the things that you have to do. So it's just kind of there are pluses and minuses, right? Obviously the plus to do and create our own stuff, whether it's in a novel or a comic series like Curse Words or something, is that there are no rules. There is no pre-existing IP rule that you have to be worried about. You can do whatever you want with and to these characters, and that is liberating and fun. It means all of the weight is on you to make it good. You cannot rely on anyone else's good work, other than obviously your artist or other collaborators you're working with on that project. But in terms of earlier stuff, it's just not there. So I love them both. I mean, I'm doing some really big work in the Star Wars space right now, which I love. It's a universe I love very much, but I also definitely feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants there. But then I'm also doing original work in my novels, and as I mentioned, this Undiscovered Country comic I'm doing, which is original concepts that have been really well received, and it's such a rush to make up your own stuff and have people like it. So I like it all.
Well, the good thing about writing Star Wars is that is a completely safe space with no fan backlash, no matter what you do.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think it's such a funny thing. I am a Star Wars fan, sort of first and foremost, more than a creator. I started, I saw A New Hope. There's no way I could have seen the original release. I was too young, but I'm pretty sure I saw one of the re-releases. I think they re-released it in 1980 or 79, maybe, just before Empire Strikes Back came out. So I think I saw that release, and then I saw Empire, and then I saw Jedi, and then I've just been linked into it ever since then. So I understand how you can feel ownership over the mythology because it's been part of the mythology your whole life, right? It's been a second history. Like I know the history of the Star Wars galaxy certainly better than I know the history of France, and I know a fair amount
Sure.
about the history of France, but I definitely know the Star Wars galaxy's history better. And I'm sure I'm not alone, right? There are people who it is almost a religion. And if you sort of break it down, it has a lot of the trappings of a religion. And there are sects, and there are schisms, and there are, minor and major deities. Like there's a lot in Star Wars that I think makes it feel like a religion. And so when you start messing around with that, people see it as holy text. Like it cannot be rewritten. It cannot be changed. It cannot be altered, and it shouldn't be. And anybody who does is a heretic, right? I think that's an extreme view, but I understand how people get there. And, people are also just so invested. They just want it to be as good as it was when they were young, how they remembered it. And I think, whether you're a prequels person or sequel trilogy or original trilogy, or you came through Clone Wars or Rebels, you have a sense of what Star Wars is. And the problem is that Star Wars is many things and should be many things. And it shouldn't have to appeal to everybody and be everybody's perfect thing, but everybody wants it to be their perfect thing. So it's an interesting fandom. I totally understand it. I respect every position on every piece of Star Wars storytelling. There are parts of it that I think are garbage, but I think the problem is when you tell other people that they are personally garbage for either having their opinion or worse, for like making the story that you think is bad. No one is an individually evil or bad person if they make a story you don't like. It's just a piece of entertainment that you didn't enjoy. And so it's complex, but there's also a lot of fun in writing a lightsaber battle. I just wrote one yesterday.
I can imagine that has to be the apex of a person of our generation. That's
yeah.
But you eventually came back around to writing prose with your phenomenal novel, The Oracle Year.
Yep.
When that book came out, so much fun. It was almost written. It seemed like by a person who had just had all of the barriers taken away. Like you just wrote the most fun, imaginative book that you could come up with. Where did that story come from, and what brought you back around to prose?
Well, I mentioned that second book, right? That I started to write. That was originally called Tomorrow or Tomorrow Today. That became The Oracle Year. And so I when my agent stopped being an agent, stopped being my agent, and sort of said that wasn't going to proceed, I put that book in a drawer or on my hard drive, to be honest. And I just went and moved into comics and worked on comics for a long time. And eventually I started to get some notoriety and success in comics, and enough that I was able to get a Hollywood manager, basically, Angela Chang Kaplan, who was fantastic, who I still work closely with today. She's amazing. And she said, well, what do you have? Because her thing is taking her whole kind of brilliant business model is finding people like me who have a lot of stories and a lot of ideas and helping shape them and then taking them and selling them in different spaces, which seems like intuitive and simple, but it's tricky. So she's like, well, as part of kind of our introductory meeting, she's like, well, what do you have? I'm like, well, I have 2 novels in a drawer. I have some screenplays. I've got this. I've got that. So she looked at stuff, and I gave her a bunch of log lines. She's like, I think this book about this prophet sounds like it could be cool. Is that ready to be read? And I'm like, I don't know. Let me look at it. And it was not ready to be read. I felt like I had significantly improved as a writer after all the work I'd been doing in comics and so on. And so I didn't want that to be my first calling card in terms of trying to get a literary agent again. So I went through and did a tightening pass. I brought the prose up. I didn't do too much story work, but I brought the prose up to a level that I was comfortable with, letting people see it. And so that went out, and that submission got me my literary agent, a guy named Seth Fishman, who is with the Gernert Company, who is amazing and represents me to this very day, as is Angela. He's like, this has a lot of potential, but you need to dig in and really I understand where it came from. You got to break it apart and make it really good. And so I did, and that took a long time. That took, I want to say another year of just sort of work, and then I gave it to him, and he gave me a couple little tweaky notes to that draft. I was like, okay, cool, I'll get to it. And this is when I was deep in the middle of writing 8 comic series a month and just had a million things going on. And so he didn't hear anything from me for a while, for 3 or 4 months. And I saw him at New York Comic Con. We had a cup of coffee. And he's like, well, so where are these revisions, man? I'm like, oh, yeah, I just been busy, and, I just haven't had time. There's just been all these things going on. And he's like, are they going to take you a lot of time? I'm like, no, not really. It all seemed pretty minor. I just haven't done it. He's like, okay, let me be clear. If you make those changes, I can sell this book in 2 weeks. And
Whoa.
oh, okay. So I went home and I made those changes in like a day or 2 days, and I gave it to him, and he sold the book in 2 weeks. And
You're like, I didn't know we were talking about an actual thing here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what it was like. I was like, well, and he's not a hyperbole person. Like, he's a hyperbolic person. He's somebody who tells it how it is, which is, I think, what you want in any sort of business relationship person. So he continues to be like that. Like, if he says something that I can set my watch by it, which is great. So that book is what the Oracle Year is, and it came out in April of 2018. It was very well received for a debut novel, made a bunch of lists, sold really well, and I'm super proud of it. It's out in paperback now. It's on, obviously, all kinds of retailers have it, Amazon, wherever you want to get it, electronic, audio, and then that kind of brings us to the second book, which just came out I guess by the time this comes out, it'll be 2 weeks back, but just a few weeks ago. Anyone.
And the new book is called Anyone. For every way that the Oracle Year was witty and funny, and a great satire, Anyone takes all of those elements and ratchets them way up in a story that is it's difficult to put in words. Terrifying in ways, exciting in ways, and you take a premise that we have seen, or at least a kernel of the premise, where two people swap heads. We've seen that kind of story a million times in different ways, and you take it to a complete end that I never would have unraveled. Tell me where the idea for this came from.
Sure. So the premise of Anyone is that a technology is invented. It's called the Flash in the book, that lets the consciousness of one person be placed in the body of another. And when that happens, your original body sort of goes to sleep, and the personality of the person you're occupying also is dormant. So it's basically it's a one-way exchange, but it's reversible. So it's a one-way exchange, but not a one-way trip. And we see that technology accidentally invented by a scientist named Gabrielle White, who is working on a cure to Alzheimer's, or trying to, and accidentally comes up with this tech, and which is often the way that scientific innovation happens. People are just working on something else, and then lo and behold, they get a result they weren't expecting. So she finds out by accidentally swapping into her husband's body. Her lab is in a barn on her property in Michigan, in rural Michigan, and she kind of blinks her eyes and ends up in her husband Paul's body, and so that's where the story begins. And we then, in the second chapter, we flip 25 years later, and we start seeing how the technology, which has become ubiquitous at this point, it's like everybody uses it the way they would use smartphones or Airbnbs. Everybody's kind of bopping into other people's bodies all the time just for various tasks, whether it's traveling to another country. You don't fly there, you just flip into a vessel, you flash into a vessel on the other side of the world, or commuting to work, or there's a million different ways it's used, and they're explored within the book, so I don't really want to spoil it too much, but the idea is that it's a world that has been very thought through and very deeply and in some ways darkly changed by this tech, just like the world has been changed in a lot of ways by things like smartphones or social media. And so each chapter then kind of flips back and forth between the present-day timeline just after the tech's invented and the future timeline when it's already changed the world. And over the course of the novel, you get to see how those two stories intertwine, how they're linked, and how how sort of the process by which the world was changed to become the future world. And so I think it's, for me, it's about a lot of things, right? It's about identity first and foremost, about how I think we as a species are having a very difficult time connecting with one another right now. I think we're very, very tribal, more than we usually are. And we're usually pretty tribal, but now it seems terrible, right? And so whether that's political or ideological or pop cultural, as we were just talking about with Star Wars, like people, like either you're with me or you're against me. And I think that's bad. I think that we should try to be a little bit better about trying to relate to other people, and at least think of other people as people before we think of them as other. And so the idea was that in theory, the flash technology maybe could make that a little bit simpler, because if someone coming up to you, you don't know the body in which they began, it's harder to assign kind of some of the judgments you would, or we do now, just without even thinking about it, based on people's external appearance. And so obviously it wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't change attitudes completely, but I think it, in the book, the idea is that it may be adjusting 10 to 20% in a better direction. People wait a little bit longer before they make snap judgments about people. So that's kind of where the idea for the book began, but then it rapidly morphed into a book about technology and then how we use it and what it means and how there are many unintended consequences of it, of any tech. Once tech is in the world, it's going to go where it goes and you can't really control it, no matter how much you might think you can. I don't know, lots of stuff. It's a book about Michigan. It's a book about New York City. It's a book about the world, all in society. A lot of things I love.
Well, it's really fun to take a technology, or maybe the promise of a technology even, and play that out to see where it will go and how it will benefit humanity, and the great and wonderful things that we will do with it. But as with all things, human nature plays into that, and a lot of times our kind of base nature comes up and is just amplified by this new technology. Does it ever scare you when you start, when you're in that kind of daydreaming phase about the book and you're kind of unraveling where will this go and just playing out scenarios? Does it scare you where these things can go?
Yeah. I mean, I think technology in general, the point of technology is to let us do things faster and more efficiently, like things we would do anyway, just faster and more efficiently and using more resources, I guess. And that is absolutely true of bad things too, right? So like a passenger liner, an airliner lets us get from New York to Tokyo much more quickly, right? But it also is a factor in climate change and global warming. And of course, if you use that plane improperly, it can cause a lot of damage, as we saw here in New York. But also, there's passenger planes and there's warplanes, right? Like tech's going to go where it goes, and you could say we would go from New York to Tokyo anyway, which is true, right? When it was sailing ships, we went, and we would have wars anyway, right? But the airplane technology lets us do both things faster and more efficiently. So it's just tech is agnostic, right? Tech is going to go where the people who use it go, but I do think it's scary because with the way it is now, like if you're talking about a hammer, right? Like a hammer is technology, but a hammer is pretty easy to understand. You smash in a nail, you pry up a nail with the other end, or you smash somebody's head in, right? Like those are the things that a hammer can kind of do. It can hit things. Now, if you're looking at a smartphone just looks like a black brick of glass, but that thing can do everything from start a war to you can have sex with it, kind of, not with the phone, obviously, but you know what I mean? Like it can be used for that type of interaction. It can be used for, as a camera, as a video camera, as a surveillance device, as a way to pay your bills, as a way to hack into your bank. Like it is a tool that has so many uses that it becomes impossible to really parse what it means anymore. And I think the internet is another great example. Like we don't know what the internet can do, and so we just focus on the things. All we do is focus on the things we know it can do and the things we do with it, as opposed to the things other people might be doing with it. And so you end up in this thing where tech is so complex and has so many capabilities now that it's just you can't wrap your head around it, and so people can abuse that, and they do.
How does your creative process differ from writing comics? And obviously, the story ideas are going to be different. They're going to come from different places. And writing the prose that you do, is your planning different, or the mechanics of writing different for you?
It is, yeah. I'm still very longhand based. That's a habit that I have not broken from those days back when I bought that first notebook in Australia that I mentioned. But I will. So obviously a novel is a much bigger undertaking. So let me talk about that second. So for a comic, I have, like, if I have a comic series, I have a moleskin notebook that is dedicated to it. So I have my Star Wars notebook, I have my Daredevil notebook, etc. And the Star Wars one has the Lucasfilm logo on it. The Daredevil one's red. I just try to color code them a little bit if I can, because it's fun. So in those, I do a lot of outlining. I do a lot of just sort of random note taking and thinking about what I'm going to do. And then I block out the issue page by page. And then from there, I usually just go and sit down on my keyboard and write it. I can do that very quickly, especially if it's on a series that I know well, or a series that I've been working on for a long time. Like Star Wars is just easy because I know that universe. I have a PhD in Star Wars, so I can just kind of sit down and whip up a Star Wars story without having to do any additional research or planning or character work or any of that. I just know what to do. Now, whether it's a creator-owned comic or a novel, it's obviously more involved because there's more to think about and more to make up. Undiscovered Country, the new book that I'm doing, is about the United States sealing itself off from the world for 30 years, like literally walling itself off, like sort of a sealed nation like North Korea kind of thing. And then it opens its borders to 7 people to come in as an expedition. And they go in to see what the United States has become. And it's radically different than anything anyone could have expected. It's sort of a big, road trip movie of a book going through a vastly different United States of America, which is really, really fun. But to write that, there's a lot of research involved. There's a lot of historical stuff. There's a lot of iconography you need to be familiar with. So I can't just write that off the top of my head. So I still use the notebooks, but there's a lot. It's much more involved. And then the next level up from that is a novel, which is really just a massive undertaking for me. I use a program called Scrivener, which has been extremely helpful to me. It's designed. It's specifically designed as kind of a word processing. It's sort of half word processor, half database. And so
Right.
you use it to develop all of the bits and pieces of the novel that you need, all of the research, all of the character sketches, all of that stuff can be kind of in the database. And then you start working on your first draft of your manuscript in the program, so you have access to all of that information whenever you need it. And I find it to be a really, really, really useful tool because you can zip around in the manuscript really, really simply in a way that's kind of harder to do in Word, and just, I don't know. I think it's a really, it's been very powerful for me. So generally speaking, I will do a lot of work in longhand on a novel, like sitting down thinking, what do I want it to be? What are the themes, characters, all that stuff. And then I will start my draft. I'll start building the Scrivener database. And then I just start working on it chapter by chapter in that, and sort of hopping between longhand. Like, so if I have a new chapter that I want to outline, I'll do that a lot of times in longhand, sitting at a coffee shop or a bar, and then I'll go back to Scrivener when it's time to type it. And then once I have a full draft of the manuscript, I export it to Word. So I have this big chunk of pages that are just sort of something I wrote as quickly as I could to get a draft complete. And then that's where it's a totally different type of work, but it's very important because that's where the shaping starts. You have this kind of roughed out sculpture, this roughed out marble block of a story, and you have to start chipping away and getting the fine features in and making it something that is special and good and unique as opposed to just a bunch of words.
I love it. The new book is called Anyone. This will, if you're looking for a great read for after Christmas, for these cold, dreary days, this is the book to get. It will keep you riveted the entire time and leave you with lots to think about. Charles, this is such a fun book. I love it, and we're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of it. There's going to be links to it in the show notes. If people are just learning about you and all of the fantastic stuff that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Absolutely. The two best places to find me are either on Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter. It's just my name, Charles Soule, my handle. So just twitter.com/Charles Soule, CharlesSoule. And then there's my website, which is charlessoule.com, which has a lot of information about what I'm working on. It has like a store for signed books, all kinds of stuff. And I also run a newsletter from that site. So it's very easy to go to the site and to subscribe, and then you get basically one email a month from me with updates and everything I'm working on, which is a bunch. So I would urge anyone who is interested in any of the stuff that I talked about today to go to charlessoule.com, sign up for the newsletter, or find me on Twitter.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to see you, Charles. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.